Welcome, everyone. My name is Julie Merino Carela, and I am the director of the Women in Energy program at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Our Women in Energy program is a signature initiative that underscores the center's commitment to train the next generation of energy leaders, particularly women and those from underrepresented groups. We strive to support new, middle, and advanced career professionals in their personal and professional development in order to address the clear lack of diversity among the energy workforce and senior decision makers. Women in Energy envisions an equitable and inclusive energy sector that is better prepared to address global energy needs. Our mission is to elevate women in the sector at all career stages by providing educational programming and professional development, creating content that addresses institutional barriers to entry and long-term success, and work with the industry to recruit and retain more women and promote them into decision-making roles. Thank you for joining us today for another installment of the Women in Energy CCUS Roadshow. We co-host the series with the Center's Carbon Management Initiative, and the Carbon Management Research Initiative focuses on speeding up decarbonization and reducing the risk and impact of climate change through carbon management. It's led by Dr. Julio Friedman, who will also be serving as our moderator today. Part of Women in Energy's goals is to highlight and raise the profile of leading female voices in energy. Today, we're honored to have experts discussing energy and carbon capture in Texas. We hope you enjoy the conversation and find it educational. To learn more about either the Carbon Management Research Initiative or the Women in Energy program, please visit our website at energypolicy.columbia.edu. With that, I will turn it over to Julio, who will now introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks, Julio.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's just a treat to be here. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Julio Friedman. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia CEPA. Thank you for joining us for the third session of the Women in Energy CCUS Roadshow. Today, we're going to discuss carbon capture and energy systems in Texas, carbon capture, use, and storage, CCUS technologies and approaches are critical to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation, industrial, and power sectors, and they are a key component to creating a more sustainable and equitable energy system. Today's conversations will highlight leading experts in the field of CCUS with a special focus on Texan policy and development, including how carbon removal technology fits into strategies to address climate change and to bring global greenhouse gas emissions to the equivalent of zero. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live. A full video will be available online in the coming days, and you'll be able to get that at the event website at the Center on Global Energy Policy. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you could submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And again, we will start with a few opening statements and a keynote speech. After that, we'll have a moderated discussion, and then finally, an open session of question and answer. Before that moderated panel discussion, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. She really needs no introduction as the remarkable Vicki Holleb, the CEO of Occidental Petroleum, and a global leader in carbon capture and storage and CO2 removal. We could not be more pleased and proud that she's joining us here today. Thank you, Vicki. And with that, I leave the microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Julio. I'd be happy to be with you anywhere in New York City, Jackson Hole, Scotland, all the places we've been together to talk about a topic that's so important to all of us. And happy to be here with the Women in Energy's conference. This is such an important thing for Columbia University to do. We wholly support it. I'm glad to be a part of it today. I'll start with just saying a few things about Occidental in general. Occidental is an oil and gas company, but we also have a chemicals business and a midstream business. Our oil and gas business develops oil and gas throughout the world, including condensates, NGLs, and natural gas. We have operations in the US mostly, but we also have a big operation in Oman, Abu Dhabi, and Algeria and Ghana currently. Our chemicals business is primarily in the US with 22 plants in the US, one in Canada, one in Chile. And that business produces caustic soda, chlorine, PVC, and vinyl chloride derivatives that produce things like like IV bags and PVC pipe. So that business produces things that are not one-time use plastics, but plastics that make our world a better place, and chlorine that makes water usable around the world. So one of the other things our chemicals business makes is an environmentally friendly raw product to make and refrigerants. And so that's an important part of the sustainability of our chemicals business. The midstream business mainly just gathers our products and gets them to market for the best possible price and to assure sustainability of flow. In our oil and gas business, that's really the core of what we're doing today to mitigate our impact on climate change. Our low carbon strategy is built on our core competence that we've developed for a long time. For 40 years, we've been using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery in the Permian Basin. And that core competence is what we've built our go forward strategy on. And we have the infrastructure in the Permian to make that happen, and to make that happen in a big way. So what we're planning to do is in the Permian is to install what will be the largest direct air capture facility in the world that will capture CO2, extract it from the atmosphere, and allow us to put it in our Permian reservoirs. The use of that will enable us to get more reserves out of that reservoir, but at a lower emission. And so it's critically important for the world for direct air capture to be a technology that over time will work. The other thing that we're doing too is we'll be capturing anthropogenic CO2 from 2 ethanol plants and from a cement plant in southern Colorado. With all of those activities, we believe we can start the acceleration of carbon capture from not only industrial sources, but from the air, apply it to places where all around the world where we operate, beginning in the Permian and expanding to Colorado, Wyoming, Oman, and Abu Dhabi over time. The significance of this, it will enable us to achieve our climate goals of reaching net zero with our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2040, and with an aspiration to get there by 2035. It will also enable us to add the elimination or offset of our scope 3 emissions by 2050. So we believe that our strategy is sustainable because we have a good business case to do it. The business case for us is that by enabling ourselves to protect the environment and the climate through this strategy, it makes it sustainable over time. In addition, it lowers the cost of CO2 for us to use in our enhanced oil recovery projects, which adds value to our shareholders. So we have a scenario where we have a sustainable plan that over time enables us to ultimately prove up this technology for the world to use in other places. So we're excited about where we are. We're excited about our plan. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Julio for the moderated discussion. If there are any other questions that we have about that, I'm excited to talk more about this.
Thank you, Vicki. And I know that you're very busy. We couldn't, again, be more happier to have you here. There are very few people in the world who know more or who have done more for carbon capture and storage. And in the Texas context, you stand alone as a titan. I wanted to ask you just 1 or 2 questions before we go to the moderated discussion. You have heard this debate over and over again about investing in innovation as opposed to investing in solutions we have. It seems that as a company, you're doing both. Do you want to comment on sort of how you think about these things in the context of the whole ecosystem?
Yeah, when we think about the whole system, all the greenhouse gases, what we're doing is trying to advance technology first in our own operations, trying to reduce emissions there. And we're doing some innovative things there too. We're trying to eliminate tanks where you have another source of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. So we're trying to ensure that from the time the molecule leaves the reservoir, that we decrease the number of points that it has to escape into the atmosphere before we get it converted to its end-use product. So that's important for our operations. The other thing with the direct air capture, there are other direct air capture facilities in the world. but not one that we can believe that can advance to the scale that we can do the direct air capture design that we're using. There's a pilot now in Canada of this design. So while our chemicals business is very familiar with the various components of how to do this direct air capture, there isn't one of this commercial scale right now. So there is still advancement of technology with respect to direct air capture that needs to happen and happen in a big way. The other thing we're doing is we have invested in what's called net power. Net power is a way to generate electrical power using gas, but using it using in what's called an alum cycle, so that you can combust it in a way to generate power that enables you to capture a pure stream of CO2 that then you can take right away and put it into a reservoir for either use or sequestration. So those are the three biggest things that we're doing to offset and mitigate our emissions and advance technology.
Outstanding. For those of you who are listening in online, you may not know that there was a Washington Post question and answer that was published just this morning with Vicky, in which they called Occidental the Tesla of carbon capture. Let me start by just saying Elon Musk is the U of Tesla. And in that context, again, we're just thrilled to have you here. Thank you again for joining us, and success with everything you do.
Thank you.
Marvelous. With that, please allow me to introduce the panelists for today's discussion. I'm going to introduce them in reverse order in which they will present. First, I'm delighted to welcome Ellen Friedman. Ellen is a partner at Nixon Peabody. She's the co-head of Energy and Infrastructure Projects team and has been working for many, many years. In fact, helping to organize and structure deals and finance projects in carbon capture and in the energy sector. Next, please allow me to introduce and welcome Deepika Nagushan. Deepika is the Program Director for Carbon Capture and Storage at the Clean Air Task Force and has been working in this arena absolutely as long as I've known her, which is something like 10 years now. You've been at Clean Air Task Force bringing an environmental NGO's perspective to this daunting challenge. Last but not least, Dr. Susan Hovorka, the head of the Gulf Coast Carbon Center at the Bureau of Economic Geology, part of the University of Texas at Austin, and the BEG actually serves, among other things, as the Geological Survey for Texas. Sue is one of the few people here today who I've known longer than Deepika. I think I met Sue in 2002 in Kyoto, actually, at GHGT 6. And she has been an international class global leader on carbon capture and storage, particularly carbon storage, over that time. We are going to be discussing carbon capture and energy in Texas. And in that context, I welcome each of the speakers, first Dr. Hovorka, then Deepika, then Ellen, to just make a couple of opening statements about how they view the field today, how it's changed, and what they see as relevant in the Texas context.
Okay, I should start, Julio. I'm Sue Hovorka. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you all, and those of you on the panel and those of you who are listening online. Julio said, what's the biggest thing that's changed? And the biggest thing is that we're here with an audience listening. This is so exciting to have people who are listening to this and wanting to know more. That's been people say, why you have this technology and you claim it works, but why is nobody interested in it? And so the fact that you guys, all of you, are interested in it, paying attention now, is really, really important. Again, it makes me so positive. So I'm a researcher at UT Austin at the Geologic Survey. We are interested in research that's going to be applicable in the near term. We usually think about a 3 to 5 year horizon, that we want to do things that people are going to need in just a few years. I worked most of my career on water and environmental issues. And this issue of, we didn't even know what it was called, that CO2, what are we going to do now? The idea of closing the loop, taking carbon from fossil fuels, putting it back into the subsurface. And I was at first a skeptic. I was worried about the impacts on water, whether the perturbation was going to be acceptable. So we started doing research on monitoring in 1999, I became a believer. It works. We've had opportunities to design and work with those who run in all kinds of injection projects. We did a study at the longest running CO2 enhanced oil recovery project at Sack Rock oil field in West Texas. And we were sure we were going to find some impacts on water. It's an old operation. And we found techniques to look for impacts on water, but we actually never found any impacts for researchers. It was quite disappointing. For CCS, though, it's very positive. We could talk more in a more sophisticated way about what this finding means, how you actually certify that what goes down has stayed down. But I'm just supposed to make a quick introduction, so I will leave this to questions about the details. How you find the right site, how you find the right approach to provide the assurance that's needed to do the deed, to put the CO2 back underground where it belongs. So that'll be my pitch for the moment.
Thank you, Sue. And again, you have so much knowledge. We look forward to tapping into it later on. Next, we're going to go to Deepika. If you just want to make an opening statement.
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Deepika Nagabushin. I'm the program director for the carbon capture program at the Clean Air Task Force. And I'm extremely delighted to be on this panel with really the who's who in this space. Just for those who may have encountered the Clean Air Task Force for the first time, I just want to spend one sentence to describe our organization. We're a 25-year-old independent nonprofit environmental group. We work on policies to advance essential climate technologies to meet mid-century climate goals. We focus on technologies such as carbon capture, and we're also focused on other technologies that we believe require sufficient policy support, such as advanced nuclear, advanced geothermal, and other necessary energy system shifts, such as moving towards zero carbon fuels and global energy access. Just a little bit on carbon capture. CATF was one of the pioneering members of sort of pushing to other stakeholders to think about carbon capture. We were one of the original members that formed the Carbon Capture Coalition that succeeded in getting Congress to put in place what we call the 45Q tax credit, which is one of the most foundational policies available to support the deployment of carbon capture technologies in the US. And I don't want to assume that everybody on the call knows about 45Q, so I just want to spend a second talking about 45Q. It's and Julio, thanks for that idea. 45Q is a federal tax credit that provides $50 a ton for each ton that is captured and verifiably and permanently sequestered. And this sort of modification of this policy came in 2018. And since then, we've seen announcements of close to 35 projects. And I think that there was a question in the Q&A about gas-fired power plants. So I just want to also shout out and say that there are some gas-fired power plants also in that list of projects that have been announced since 2018. And there's more. There's coal plants, there's cement plants, there's biorefineries, ethanol, and even direct air capture that Vicky was just talking about, all under development because 45Q helps build that business case. But I also want to point out that there is going to have to be support in form of additional financial incentives and ecosystem build out, that will enable these projects to actually be built, although they are announced and under development. If all these projects are built, which would obviously assume that other incentives are in place, then we would see a doubling of global carbon capture capacity that exists today. And that sort of brings me a little bit to Texas. Texas has a very important role in where we are today with this technology. And I think like Sue said, the kind of research that Sue has done and the industry has done, like Oxy, has taught us so much about what we know in terms of the permanence of CO2 sequestration in geologic formations, and the sort of the know-how of how we actually implement these projects. And that gives us a real understanding that this is a workable technology. It works. Texas is also home to one of the first large-scale commercial coal-fired power plant demonstration projects, Petronova. Texas is home to 2/3 of all CO2 pipelines that the US has that carry CO2 from source to sink. And one thing I do want to point out is that build out that I just mentioned, 2/3 of 5,000 miles of pipelines that is in Texas is a result of federal policy that happened in the 70s and 80s. So it's just sort of I would say, an innovation ground where we have seen private sector respond to government policy and build these projects out, which I think can be repeated given we have the right kind of policies developed and we implement them in time. And of course, with Texas, it's going to play a huge role in deploying these technologies. Several of the projects that are currently underway are in Texas, given the existing ecosystem, given the vast amounts of geologic storage resources, and also organizations that know how to do this stuff. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions on the role of Texas. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Deepika. And again, so much rich material to get into. We'll have to wait on that, though. And instead, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ellen Friedman. Ellen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Julio. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today with so many accomplished women. I think that what the future holds for CCS projects needs a lot of women. I'm going to say things that probably paint women with too broad a brush, but I think it takes creativity and sort of a long-term view and attention to detail, which is going to get these deals done. And obviously a lot of people have to come together. And I think from my perspective, that this is going to be a very interesting and challenging time to try to put the different verticals together, at least in from my perspective. That is one of the biggest challenges to marry people that do what had been traditional oil and gas exploration, geology, understanding the science there, and trying to take advantage of tax credits, which for most of the time that's usually been an area that has been the focus of housing investments or renewables. And so, there's going to be a lot of educating that's going to be needed to really bring these projects all the way to completion. And just, my background and, that of my law firm, Nixon Peabody, has been focusing on development and financing of energy and infrastructure projects. Some of them involve P3 structures. We do a lot of tax credit finance in the renewable sector. And a lot of what 45Q is focused on is trying to bring some of the understood structures from the renewable areas, particularly the wind space, to help, I think, accelerate understanding and comfort with investing in this new sector from a finance perspective. There's so much opportunity, and the policy drivers and the legislative initiatives just keep popping up every single day. It's kind of hard to keep track, but there are so many really good minds trying to think about how to motivate and make these projects pencil out. As Deepika mentioned, additional incentives are going to be needed. But with the ones that are on the table, I think it requires some creativity to move money around in the structures that are currently provided for. And I think you need good lawyers, creative finance folks, as well as the drivers from companies like Oxy, certainly looking to help with partnerships and innovative technology that I think is going to really be important going forward. And I know you're probably going to have lots of questions for all of us, so I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Indeed, I will. And this is an incredibly rich substrate to build an extended discussion and conversation. Before we do that, though, I know that Vicki Holleb, CEO of Occidental, has to leave in just a couple of minutes. Before she goes, I was going to ask her one last question and see if she had one additional thing to add to the conversation. With respect to the question, Vicki, you make a point about the business context for this. And some of that is the present business context, which you're doing, and people like Ellen and Deepika and Sue are helping you. Some of it is future business context, but you sort of see that very clearly. If you could just take a minute and talk more about how you see this in terms of helping your shareholders.
Yeah, the way it helps our shareholders is it provides a lower cost and sustainable source of CO2 for our enhanced oil recovery. So over time, that's very, very important, because I think one of the things that people don't realize is that in oil reservoirs around the world, not a lot of the hydrocarbons are recovered through most of the processes that we use today. You have to use enhanced oil recovery to get a majority of the hydrocarbons out of the reservoir. For example, in a lot of the wells that are drilled, you're only going to recover 25 to 30% at best of the hydrocarbons in place. With CO2 enhanced oil recovery, you can get that recovery up to above 70%. So our view of this also for the world means that the more places that we apply CO2 enhanced oil recovery, the greater the recovery from existing reservoirs. The more you can recover from existing reservoirs, the less expensive that is. So it lowers the cost for consumers, helps the economy, and it prevents us from needing to go into places to develop new sources of oil and gas where they possibly exist in sensitive areas. So you can avoid doing some drilling in the future where we might not want to drill, versus getting more oil and gas out of the ground. And I would say that that business case there for us is critically important. We believe that the last barrel of oil produced in the world must come from a CO2 enhanced oil recovery reservoir. That will be the lowest emitting barrel of oil in the world at the time. So it's really important that we push this technology and that we advance it. And we wouldn't be able to do it with unless we had people like Sue and Deepika and Ellen doing their work. Without their work and laying the groundwork, we were a part of the Carbon Capture Coalition, and it was a great group of people. It was amazing to see that coalition come together and work together. That's collaboration that must be in place for us to advance this around the world, because 45Q has helped us to be bold enough to execute this plan. Now, the other thing that's helped, of course, is the California low carbon fuel standard. But in addition to that, this project we've announced has other companies very, very interested in this now. We're talking to other companies who need a way to offset their emissions because they can't do it any other way, like companies in aviation and in maritime industries. United Airlines just signed up to go with us and to build the direct air capture in the Permian. And so it's a huge thing for our company. The other thing is that I can't tell you how engaged and excited our employees are about this, and especially our earlier career employees who may have had some concerns about getting into the oil and gas industry and staying in the oil and gas industry. As long as they can be a part of a company that's committed to doing the things that will make a difference in our world, they're all excited about that and ready to stay. So the only thing I would say is what's missing here, and I'm a little bit disappointed right now, is the lack of engagement and interest from the bigger banks. You know, if we, and Ellen may have some things to say about that, but if we could get the bigger banks investing in things that will make this much difference in the world, rather than putting their attention and dollars where they are to try to mitigate, but on a much smaller scale, we could really advance this a lot faster. So again, it's that collaboration and coalition from multiple sectors, and especially from those who have the wherewithal to make a big difference. So with that, I'll let you go, Julio. I appreciate being a part of this, and thank you all. It was good to see you. Appreciate what you do for us.
Feelings mutual. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your continued leadership.
Thanks.
With that, let's turn to the rest of the panel. We have joining us here Dr. Susan Hovorka, Deepika Nagushan, and Ellen Friedman, who all look at the problem set somewhat differently. I've been looking through the questions, and a number of the questions that have come up, I think each of you would answer differently. So let me start with this one. What's actually required to get a CCS project off the ground? And I want to actually do it in that order. Sue first, then Deepika, then Ellen. What do we need to get a lot of projects going?
I'll start with the technical part because my colleagues will answer the policy and financial part. I mean, the first thing is money, but I'll leave that to them. The next things we need to have is a place to put the CO2 underground. Many places on Earth have a suitable place, but not every place on Earth has a suitable place. You have to have the right rocks that will accept large volumes of CO2 and retain them permanently. You can't inject anything in the US underground unless you can show that it's going to stay where you put it. This is a requirement of the Safe Drinking Water Act 1972 that is required and enforced and done. The fact that you don't know about failures of underground injection is an indicator in general that it's a highly successful engineeringly feasible activity. So you have to have a place to put it that will accept it and be permittable, and the permitting process is rigorous. We can get into a lot of detail about what's required, but you have to show what goes down stays down under the geologic conditions and the engineering conditions.
Does Texas have that?
Texas has it in, you know, when we first started, I looked at this map and said, oh my God, the place to go is in Texas. And it's a global hotspot of places to put CO2 underground. Of course, there are places in Texas you can't put it underground. For example, where I live, you can't put it underground, and I can tell you in detail why, because it won't accept the fluids and it won't retain the fluids. If you try, it's not an NIMBY effect. It's a matter of what's there. So you have to work with what's there. The second thing you have to have is a viable source of CO2, and I think I'll let others talk about what makes a viable source of CO2 that you can capture and transport it to the storage site.
Thank you. Deepika, your perspective, what does it take to get a project going?
If I had just very few words to answer that question, I'd be like, we need a united, singular strategy to make projects happen, and we have to sort of set a target and say, okay, we're gonna do 300 million tons on an annual basis by the year 2035, and just sort of go after it. But of course, we have to figure out what the recipe for that is. Even if we can, so if we consider that as sort of a generic direction that we're going in to meet that 300 million tons on an annual basis by 2035, we have 15 years to go. What we need is to first understand that many CO2 sources are going to cost. I know there were a lot of questions in the chat, in the quick Q&A about costs. The costs are different for different sources. The higher the concentration of CO2, the sort of more economical it might be. And of course, like Sue said, the distance to geologic storage resource and the access to transportation infrastructure and existing storage infrastructure, which is where Texas plays a huge role, given that there's already infrastructure in place, makes it a very, very popular destination, I would say, for projects that want to just sort of do it really fast. And so I would say that it requires for us to build on top of 45Q to meet those different levels of costs that it will require to do CCS on different types of sectors. 45Q currently may be very good for something like an ethanol where there's high concentration of CO2 already. So the costs are slightly lesser, relatively speaking. But then if you go up to like cement or steel or, so we need additional incentives. So sort of getting in place the right kind of incentives to fill the right kind of gaps would be very important. This is the deployment part. However, I think we're also at a stage where we have to take a step back from here and be like, okay, what do we need to get us on that track? And what we need is basically support from the government. If Oxy is to be the Tesla of CCUS or the other way around, we have to understand the commonality has to be government support. And the kind of innovation and R&D support we need in this technology space is immense, and we have to do it fast. So I think the sort of authorizations that we saw in the Energy Act of 2020 in December of last year need to be turned into actual funding allocated to supporting demonstrations, large-scale demonstrations across sectors. So across coal, across natural gas, across steel and cement. And we need to see government support potentially going from the first to the fifth of a kind sort of demonstration that brings the costs down from innovation. And at that point, I think the deployment incentives really will kick in to sort of support that wide scale deployment. But of course, we also need a third piece, which is the ecosystem. We do need to support that ecosystem build out of CO2 pipelines and transportation infrastructure going to saline storage sites. We don't have large scale saline projects except one so far today in the country. And that's really, capturing 1 million tons of CO2 a year. We have to really scale that up. And so it's going to take some investment and upfront investment from the government side, whether it's federal or state governments. I think that's sort of the 3 parts. So the R&D, the ecosystem, and then the deployment incentives that fills up the gap above 45Q. Those are the 3 things I would say. And in the future, we will see carbon pricings of some kind, economy-wide. So that will be the 4th piece, I would say.
Terrific. I'm going to come back to some of what you said in just a minute, but first, Ellen, again, what's your perspective? What does it take to get projects rolling?
You're absolutely right. We're all going to be answering this in a slightly different way. And I know Vicky is not on, but I would tell her if she were, and for anybody else that's interested. I mean, we have been having conversations with some of the the largest of the national banks who are definitely rolling up their sleeves and trying to make structures that work for them and to get things through their credit committees and to get themselves sort of positioned to approve investments as they mature to the point that they can actually propose them to their investment committees. So it's definitely in process. But backing into your specific question, when we talk about these carbon capture projects, some of them are in the billions of dollars, and to get investments of that magnitude, in terms of a concentration of risk in one project or one industry, the investors, whether they be tax investors or debt or cash equity, are going to look at the risks, and they're going to need to be comfortable that it's been de-risked as much as possible. And the risks that they might be looking at include the technology risk, and so the more of the demonstration projects, the bigger that they get, I think the better that, the more that part of it will be de-risked. There are certainly people that are looking at, long-term sequestration and whether there's any kind of long-term liability associated with that. And, whether they are putting themselves or their, shareholders or investors at risk if they were perhaps to hold on to a sequestration site for forever. And the scientists really, I think, have to be talking to those types of investors to explain, you know, how they are getting comfortable with this and why this is not, you know, from a scientific perspective, an unmanageable risk. I think the other, you know, 45Q provides a 12-year tax credit that is based upon the number of metric tons of carbon that's captured and sequestered or commercially utilized. There have been some safe harbor guidance for partnership flip models, as well as final regulations that came out in January of 2021. There's still a lot of questions that have yet to be answered that have been posed to the IRS that I think are keeping some tax investors on the sidelines. It's not a perfect, you know, structure, and there are a lot of you know, folks scratching their heads asking if it's okay to flow cash to an emitter that buys carbon from them, or, you know, even though it's a waste product. And similar questions as to what you can pay the sequestration party if you were going to elect to transfer the credit to them, which again kind of looks like, you know, and people are worried that, you know, there are certain underpinnings of tax credit law that have been developed over time for other credits, which don't allow you to basically buy and sell credits. And so there is some, I think, need for additional support from the IRS to give that additional level of comfort to tax investors who are going to be getting asked to put, you know, billions of dollars at stake. And those clarifications can take the form of private letter rulings or, you know, additional guidance. But at this point, it's unclear whether, you know, we're going to be getting that. And in fact, whether people are just going to have to, you know, look to their lawyers, and their lawyers are going to have to issue tax opinions on points that may not be fully, you know, settled at this point. There's also, I think, in terms of debt financing, you know, beyond the construction period, questions as to how to structure that if you've got a project where the only cash flow is the monetization of the tax credit. You know, there are structures where there could be other revenue streams, such as the RIMS or the low carbon fuel credit from California, or maybe some other voluntary credit programs. But you know, there's some difficulty just structuring these deals, and you know, the policy folks are really, you know, doing great things, and I think sometimes the details in how these deals get executed, and the risk, you know, tolerance, and what, you know, check the box kinds of things investors and debtors, I'm sorry, lenders and tax investors are going to require, you know, are going to need to be really scrutinized, and the more support from a regulator perspective, once these you know, laws are passed, the devil's in the details, I think,
Right.
to get people, you know, to pony up the money that's really going to be required here.
Right. So I was going to actually, before I go to you, Sue, I want to get, we'll get back to you next, but first I wanted to ask both Ellen and Deepika. We've been getting a lot of questions about 45Q, and they've come into two forms. One of them is just how does the money work? And the other is what's the prospect for amending 45Q, for enhancing it or increasing it or doing direct pay or one of these other things. If you'd each just take a minute and just dive into that, and then I'll go back to you, Sue.
You want me to start?
Yeah, go
Sure.
ahead.
I can start. Okay, so 45Q was on the books for a while. It has been amended substantially. It was amended in early 2018, and it no longer has a cap and on how many credits would ultimately be awarded. It has two different levels of credits, either $35, I mean, and it ramps up to 35 in 2026, and then but suffice it to say it's either $35 or $50. It requires that projects have begin construction, which is a term of art that has been defined under the renewables area, but it's slightly different for 45Q. But both the emitter, if it didn't exist in 2018, and the carbon capture equipment have to have begun construction. And now it's before 2026. It had been earlier, but at the end of 2020, legislation moved that out 2 years. And what you get when you build one of these is a 12-year period from the date that the carbon capture equipment is placed in service. The owner of the carbon capture equipment gets the benefit of this credit, tax credit. It's a business tax credit, and based on the amount of carbon that's disposed of in a geologic storage, and that's the $50. Or if it's done through EOR, it's $35, and if it's done through the commercial use, and that's a new feature from 2018, they would also get $35. That commercial use aspect, I think, really requires a little bit more development by the regulators in order for people to understand exactly what's there.
Great.
I can keep going, but
yes. Well, there's a lot in there, and as you know from experience, the details really matter. Deepika, can you talk a bit about sort of where the policy is at and what we're looking at in live legislation?
Yeah, sure. I just want to add to what Ellen said. I think for people that might be more familiar with the production tax credit for wind, the 45Q works very similar to that. Like for every ton you verifiably store, and for all projects, you have to be approved under the US EPA class 6 for saline projects, and you have to sort of have proper reporting that verify that the CO2 is stored. I just want to make sure that point is highlighted and is emphasized, that once you have an approval is when you are now eligible to claim those credits, because it's verified then. So to answer your question on direct pay, so one of the things that's difficult, as Ellen pointed out, is to sort of find these tax equity investors for these projects. There is a saturated market in that space, but one of the things that we have understood from having conversations with project developers is that when the tax credit is converted into what we call direct pay, or just in other words, a subsidy, it would help projects reach financial close much more easily, which is what we need at this point. And this specific change is currently in a legislation that was recently introduced called the Access 45Q, and there is a lot of support around this, and we're getting I don't know if I don't really have a view on where it might head from here, but I think that there's a lot of support across stakeholders in the coalition that want to make this happen, and there's a lot of congressional support across both aisles. That's what I would say. And then in terms of another policy that recently got introduced both in the Senate and in the House, which also has extremely interesting bipartisan support, is called the SCALE Act, which is basically supporting ecosystem build out. So there's going to be a project that will receive grants to build out pipelines. There's 0% financing for oversizing of the pipelines, so you can build pipelines that are larger than the volume you have contracted for, so that you can expect additional customers to pay to transport their CO2. And there's more. There's also a procurement provision in there for low carbon materials using CCS. So I'm probably missing something there, but this is also a very, very hot topic right now. There's a lot on the CATF website for those of you who might be more interested in learning about this.
Thank you. I was going to get to the SCALE Act at some point, so you beat me to it.
Mhm.
So you've been waiting very patiently. Please, you had a thought to add to all of this discussion.
My colleagues are the pros, but I being a non-finance person, want to point out the obvious, that it's free to release CO2 to the atmosphere when you build a campfire. To do something else it is energy intensive to, even to brush the smoke away from the campfire. If you want to capture it, keep it out of the atmosphere and store it, it's more expensive. So many people have framed this as too costly. And I would say that this is a value judgment. I point out to those of you thinking about it, it's a value judgment that there are many activities that we pay to have our waste products properly dealt with. I could point out wastewater, for example. Considerable amount of one's water bill is wastewater fees. You look at your own wastewater fee, how much you pay in your water bill to have your water treated post. So also the solid waste, your personal bill or your industrial bill, you pay for proper treatment of waste materials. Right now, we're allowing ourselves and each other to release to atmosphere. And we're realizing that this is not a best practice, and maybe considered in the future gross. If you could see the CO2, if it came out purple, you would feel very differently than this invisible gas. Now we realize that even though it's not purple, it has this impact. So the willingness to pay is very simple. Are you going to put it in the atmosphere, leave it there for future generations, or are you going to pay? And the person who's going to pay and the ultimate is in some way the energy consumer. It's not the federal government. Actually, in the mechanism we can struggle with, but we people who consume energy need to pay to have our energy decarbonized somehow.
So yeah, there's really only three sources of money: taxpayers, ratepayers, and shareholders. And what somebody's got to pay, and that's actually where most of the policy debate is who pays as opposed to pay for what. I will say, though, that it's not strictly a value judgment. We actually came up with a methodology called the levelized cost of carbon abatement that would allow you to assess whether or not that makes sense. And in some cases, one of the questions that we received is, isn't it smarter to do solar and wind investment? And the answer is in some places, yes, but not everywhere and not always. And really the question is, how do you get your maximum abatement? And in some cases, it looks like CCS is one of those technologies. I do want to put this back into the Texas context just a little bit. And one of the things, Sue, that we have learned is that the models that you laid out for wastewater treatment, for solid waste treatment, there is basically a utility model. We don't really have a utility to do carbon management, but I know that's something Clean Air Task Force has thought about quite a lot. First of all, could you just take a minute and explain what that is? And then do you think that's reasonable as a business model in Texas?
You want me or Deepika?
Deepika.
Oh, okay.
And then
so I know the word utility might give people a specific picture in their mind. I just want to sort of start from a clean slate. I think what the idea really is that, and I think Sue, you'll correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, a natural geologic basin where CO2 can go sort of lends itself to a natural monopoly concept, because it's a physical formation that has natural boundaries that don't, natural boundaries don't respect man-made boundaries like state lines. But the idea there is to sort of think about what happens next when we have many projects wanting to access the most ideal sites through which you can inject into that same basin. What kind of competition comes up, and how do we, for the benefit of reaching CO2 capture and storage at the least cost, what kind of strategic sort of basin level planning and thinking might need to occur to sort of direct the private sector players to the right kind of sites to keep the costs low, sort of to avoid the tragedy of commons, which was the idea based on which the natural gas utility was formed. So that's the idea right now. We're sort of still conceptualizing the, we have the science basis for it. We have the understanding around the natural monopoly that's sort of supported by the natural boundaries of the basin, but we're sort of shopping this around a little bit to with our stakeholder friends who can guide us on what kind of business model might work in different locations. For instance, with Texas, there's access to a large potential storage resource in the offshore space, whereas the ideal injection sites might be few, or the access into that basin might be limited. But the good thing is that the entire basin has one landowner, which is the federal government, and so or the state government. I'm sorry, I'm probably mixing that up. Sorry. So the idea is that while it's simple because it's got one single owner, and there's only one negotiation that you'd need to do in terms of pore space ownership and access to storage of CO2 there. It might require some additional planning in terms of surface infrastructure that would go and provide access to, one of the largest industrial conglomerates, clusters in the country, which is Texas. So with almost, one of the, I think if you counted the industrial emissions from Texas industry alone, it would be almost like the third or fourth state in the country in terms of CO2 emissions. So that's just how much CO2 there is to be captured from the state, and then have sort of figure out how do we ideally and optimally send the CO2 into that resource using limited access to surface infrastructure. So that's the idea, how it would work in Texas, and the kind of development of the idea we continue to do. In California, it would be different. In Illinois, Michigan area, it would be different because there has to be conversation across multiple states. In California, it would still just be one state boundary, however, multiple surface owners in terms of land, and of course, creating complications around access to pore space there. So there's going to be different ideas, different ways we'll have to make this happen potentially. But the idea is to do risk minimization, resource optimization, and safety maximization, if I can say that.
Excellent. Go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, the utility idea might get its start because the waters of the U.S. are owned by the states. Most states have 3 miles. In Texas, because of history, got 10.3 miles of state waters. In Texas context, the state waters are, and the subsurface below it is managed by the General Land Office, and the revenues go to the public schools, which is really interesting.
You're talking here about the General Land Office.
The General Land Office, who manages on behalf of the people of Texas, the state waters. The Texas legislature 10 years ago assigned them to start a repository, which had a kind of a utility type feel. So we'll see how the General Land Office and the Texas legislature work this out. But it may because of the single landowner, there's an opportunity anyway to do what Deepika was saying, to optimize. I've seen this also done in other countries, for example, UK, where it's the Crown estate, right? So the correct management of the Crown's lands is considered something that should be handled for optimization of the storage resource. So there's a possibility. And onshore, it's difficult because the property ownership of the subsurface is private. So, and we need more policy work to determine how the rights of the property owners to the pore space intersect regulatory and commercial interests. And once all three can be made and have an agreement, then things can go forward. But the procedures for attaining such agreement are immature.
Mm-hmm.
Ellen, you want to say something?
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to say that there's some parallels here, perhaps with the auctioning off of offshore leased areas by the federal government for wind projects to be built. I mean, it is a public, land, and from my understanding, I mean, these are auctioned off, and then at the end of the day, the private entity is responsible for doing what they had bid to do and maintain the property over the long term until the lease is over. I mean, I don't see the government's actually, beyond the point of creating an auction or providing, geologic research that it has in its possession. I think at some point this becomes a private enterprise, and the idea of having, I mean, it makes policy sense from to have this be a public service and have people hold themselves out to third parties who might be interested in using it as a sequestering site. I just, there was language in the SCALE Act, which I just briefly looked at, that talked about having it be a common carrier. And there's to the extent that somebody that's working with the government or takes government money through the SCALE Act, if it were to be passed, has to hold themselves open for general use. I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to do the carbon capture equipment, installations, because they really require, some firm capacity on the transmission lines and in the sequestration wells in order to provide the investors, the confidence that they're going to, that availability is going to be there. And, I think that these are all great ideas. We just have to work out the details.
Mm-hmm.
And just on the pore space, I think a lot of the legislation that's coming out now, recognizing that, while they're individual landowners, they provide for eminent domain rights, which, would not allow a single landowner, for instance, to hold up an entire project, recognizing that there's a public benefit there.
Although I believe that Texas has a particular way of thinking about eminent domain, which may be a little different than other parts of the country. I don't want to, I could literally do this exact topic for a day. Like I literally could, but what I'd like to do instead is actually open up to some of the specific questions. And again, if you have more questions, please add them to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This one is actually from Jason Selch. This is a question which we see a lot of lately, which is, while it's clear that CCS and CCUS decreases CO2 emissions, will it help address other issues of environmental justice, such as pollution or equity or jobs or these other sorts of things? Again, I'm sure you all have very different thoughts about this. If you don't object, Deepika, I'd love to start with you. And in particular, not just the issue of sort of equity around climate change, but also specifically around these non-CO2 pollutants.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jason, for that question. It is very important to understand the role of CCS in changing the air emissions, especially the other criteria pollutants. In fact, it's something that has not been very well studied, but what we do know is that CCS does require when you use a solvent, specifically an amine solvent, to do carbon capture, it is not very tolerant to the other pollutants like SOx and NOx, and what it ends up requiring is pre-treatment of those criteria pollutants to a very, very it's sort of bringing it down almost. Bringing it down almost to zero. So, CATF kind of has sort of wanted to study this topic. So what we've done is we've just begun a research project specifically focused on Texas and in California on cat crackers within refineries and on cement plants. So we're doing we're doing 4 case studies 2 of each. We're trying to understand what that treatment would look like on some large emitters from these specific stacks that are sources of high, concentration of CO2, but also are the worst offenders in terms of SOx and NOx. And of course, we're also focusing on PM and VOCs as well, trying to see what kind of pretreatment would be needed for using amine solvents for carbon capture, and how clean can we make it in addition to removing just the CO2. So this is a study that we're currently doing, and we're hoping to have some answers by the end of the year on both modules, both cement and refineries. And we'll be obviously publishing this material soon as we can get it done. So yeah, and also we're going to talk about public health impacts as a result of these reductions, and also sort of identify whether it's fence line communities that get impacted or downstream. So we're sort of just working on that, on those chapters at this point.
Mm-hmm. Let me give a quick shout out actually to Sarah Forbes at the Department of Energy, who's actually done quite a bit of work on this topic and has been on prior Women in Energy CCUS meetings. Speaking of the Department of Energy, I'm going to go to a question from Max Colby, and this is basically for Sue. How is the government supporting startup tech companies who are trying to get into the space? Is there support for feasibility studies or pilot programs, et cetera?
There have been a lot. The DOE has run a program for 20 some years supporting CCS, and including a number of ventures that started as pre-commercial and then became increasingly commercial. The current DOE's program is called Carbon Safe. SAFE is an acronym. So, and there are some dozens of projects that have been supported by government, although they bring a significant industry cost share that scattered all over the US to begin to develop sites. Since our topic is Texas, I might point out that so far there have been no carbon safes in Texas. This is a problem we need to solve. There have been other programs, however, that have supported startups, for example, that were very successful. For example, the capture from air products, which is a hydrogen facility in the Valero refinery in Port Arthur is capturing about 1 million tons of CO2 that was formerly emitted to the atmosphere and storing it for enhanced oil recovery at Hastings Field. And this was possible because of significant DOE funding, competitive funding. And then the Petronova plant, through a long program of DOE funded clean coal projects, was received enough incentive to get started.
Thank you. This question is, I think, best for Ellen. It's from Paresh Patel. It says, to Vicky's point on big banks, what potential do you see for innovative, sustainable financing vehicles and instruments, things like transition bonds, to drive more capital flows into carbon management projects?
I think that the banks are definitely hearing from their backers and funds looking for ESG projects. And I think that the structures that we need to come up with here have to work together with the 45Q structures. If the 45Q credit becomes a direct pay, as has been proposed, and I'd love for that to happen. It certainly will I think make the thinking on all of this a lot simpler. But you need a cash flow to point to stand, to serve as bonds of any type. And if we were to have the carbon capture equipment and the owner of the emitter be the same, where the emitter provides a product or, fertilizer, or it's a hydrogen plant, or it's a power plant, and there's some benefit that it receives, above and beyond what it would have otherwise received without the carbon capture equipment. That cash flow, combined with either the 45Q or the low carbon fuel credit from California, could service bonds that are issued by that emitter or by the CCE owner. I mean, we've come up with some interesting structures that might basically do some sort of tax sharing arrangement, basically with a tax investor, assuming that we, don't have the credit legislatively, paid out by the U.S. government. There are different structures to basically take the monetized tax credit and use that to service debt. But these are a lot of very creative structures, which, they're all being thought of and noodled over and discussed, by banks and lawyers.
Excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, Deepika, please add.
Okay, great. I just wanted to, quickly say that, there's gonna, as I mentioned earlier, there's gonna be different costs to different projects applied to different sources. With cheap debt, I just want to say that the impact of cheap debt, even if it were to be like really low debt, it really would not completely remove the need for like a higher value of 45Q, because the cost of raising capital, or the just sort of the, I would say, total cost of debt or equity would not be it's not the biggest share of the cost of like the total per ton removal cost. So I think that I just want to point out that there are two strategies we can use. One is sort of chip away at these pieces, like with one policy doing making debt cheap, one policy making equity cheap, and sort of stack them all up. But on the other hand, another way to do it could be just sort of blow up 45Q in a way that is easier and kind of covers so it just depends on what's politically more feasible, fast, doable. Just wanted to sort of throw that little perspective in there.
Yeah, so just a couple of quick add-ons to that. If you're capturing CO2 from an ethanol plant or a hydrogen plant, it costs less than 45Q. If you're capturing from a natural gas power plant, it costs more than 45Q. It's just, people often ask me like, well, how come you haven't done this? And there's a reason why, you just can't get paid. In this, I want to actually answer a short question we got from Mary Harding. Is there a total budget figure or appropriations number for 45Q? Again, 45Q is not an appropriation. It's a tax credit, and so it is scored. When it was scored, it was anticipated to be on the order of $5 billion total. Just for record, that is 1/10 what the wind production tax credit is. It is 10% of the wind production tax credit, just to try to put these things in some kind of scale. I do want to get to a different question that we've had here around CO2 utilization, actually, and that this is increasingly, again, a hot topic, and whether there are other uses for CO2 than just direct storage or enhanced oil recovery. And I was hoping either Sue or Deepika might talk about that for a bit.
Okay. Utilization is incredibly exciting, especially for chemical engineers, because CO2 is carbon is such an interesting molecule. You can do so many things with it. The idea that you could take the CO2 that's captured from the air or from a facility and convert it back into fuel is very engaging. And it's the kind of idea that a lot is known, but that question has never been asked that way much before. So there's a lot of potential to explore that. However, when you listen to people, I'm not an expert at this at all, but when you listen to people like Howard Herzog or Garrett and Rochelle, who are chemical engineer people, to do this conversion, you're pushing the energy content of the molecule up the energy slope. So CO2 is very strong bonds. To turn it into a fuel, you have to break those bonds and create a molecule that can react to release energy. So you have to put energy into the system. So the utilization for a fuel issue, it means that you have to have a source of energy that is available. And so there's a lot of potential to do this to convert CO2 into something that's used for energy storage. But remember, this is not magic. You have to pay for the energy somehow, and you have to make sure that it makes sense in an economic sense, that using this energy to convert CO2 into fuel is actually a best use of energy and money, therefore.
Mhm.
There's also a lot of other products that you can make CO2 into that I think are perhaps more low-hanging fruit. For example, making cement releases a lot of CO2. You took limestone, calcinated, it releases CO2. To make cement that takes CO2 back up, or to make aggregate that takes CO2 up, or to make other products in the whole array of organic-based products like sneakers or things you can. But it's very important in all of them that you do a life cycle, that you remember that just because it took up CO2 doesn't mean that it was necessarily either net positive or economically feasible. You have to put together the whole chain in what's called life cycle and make sure that you're winning. And therein lies the challenge. So if you see these utilization things, you need to, first question, you should tell me about the life cycle.
Deepika, anything to add?
Yeah, I have two points to make. One is that I think utilization is definitely going to be part of the mix. Some utilization will be, reusing CO2, whereas some will actually be permanently sequestering it. There's going to be, all kinds. But I think in the initial stages, what we'll need is some high value buyer of the CO2, even if I would not, I actually, this is the second point which I was going to make. I'm not so worried in the beginning about the life cycle emissions, because I feel like at the end of the day, we need to get the technologies out there. And so a high value buyer of CO2, even if the life cycle is not super, clear, or is not, it's not permanent sequestration, I would not be opposed to it, so to speak, because I personally think at this point, the job right now is to get projects out there and really, these are expensive projects, some of them, at least if you think about direct air capture, they need buyers of that CO2. So I think that to me is an important point from a advancement of technology perspective. And then the point is also about scale. Really just, if we're thinking about climate scale, there are very few options in terms of utilization that can potentially even accept the volume at the rate. Like for instance, if a project is producing 1 million tons a year, do we have a utilization industry that can actually accept all of that 1 million tons from a project and utilize it at that rate on an annual basis? I think that those are the important questions here. And cement, I know I'm not the expert on cement. However, there are organizations that are doing some research on this, like Carbon 180. Cement emissions are almost 8% of the global emissions and or more. And there is a way to sort of accept back all the CO2 that limestone emitted while we were making concrete. So there is a way to sequester it permanently, and apparently there is a lot of climate scale potential there, but it's just, I'm not completely familiar with it. But so I would say depleted oil and gas reservoirs and cement potentially could be a scalable option there. But in the beginning, I'm not so worried about life cycle.
So there's so many questions to go after in here, and we just don't have time for all of them, but I do want to make sure that I leave a little bit of time for closing statements and for Julie. So there's going to be two questions. I'd like to really answer these quickly if we could. Just bite in, try to provide a short answer on these two important topics. We've gotten a lot of questions around class 6 wells. talk about one of the things you need for a project, you need a class 6 well. If you'd each just give like a 1 or 2 line sort of thought about sort of, will class 6 be revisited? What's the likelihood that the Railroad Commission will ask for primacy? Just, you know, your thoughts about class 6 and its current status.
So we hear very strong rumors that Texas will apply for primacy. And the Railroad Commission, and there's a bill and making its way through the legislature. It'll be arrogant of me to assume what the legislature will decide, but the flags are all flying, yes, that this will happen and proceed, and Texas will do the deed. Class 6 needs revision because it's 10 years out of date. CCS has made a lot of progress, so there's opportunity to streamline and reduce the burden on all parties to, as well as increase the efficiency of the regulation to make sure that stakeholders needed for quality storage are met.
Deepika, then
I'll
Ellen?
add that, you know, I think that with class 6, the only class 6 well that we've had in the US, you know, took about 5 years or 4 years to actually get the permit. All I'd say is that, you know, either through primacy or through beefing up the workforce at the EPA to try and make the process faster for projects would be very important to get the sort of rate of project deployment that we would need.
Yeah, I think part of the SCALE Act is to provide funds to beef up the staff at the EPA to review the applications. I think we also, you know, as far as technology since the last iteration of the class 6 regs, I mean, Julio, you and I spoke earlier about the monitoring. There's, you know, there seems to be a lot of very cheap, very sensitive equipment that I think can really help characterize, you know, sites as well as monitor sites that are being, you know, constructed. So I'm a lawyer. This is probably a more science, but, you know, getting this right and keeping, you know, investors, you know, from being exposed to liability, you know, is key, and doing this at the right place in the right way is very important.
Indeed. And in fact, Dr. Hovorka has deployed a bunch of those very sensitive technologies in the field and knows quite a lot about them. Let me just move on to the different topic about what this takes, and but it takes in the Texas context and takes in the general context. One of the things it takes is it takes human beings. We need more people, really across the board, technical people, lawyers, financiers, regulators, public stakeholders. If you could just talk a minute about the human capital needs and where you see Texas may have an advantage.
Who did you want to answer that, Julio?
Why don't we start with Deepika, actually, and then go to Ellen and then Sue.
I think I just, one thing that I would say is that, you know, we heard Vicky at the beginning of this event, and the kind of plans that an oil company like Oxy is making to participate in development of this solution that is a climate solution. I think it really is sort of representative of the kind of companies with skill sets that know what's underground and how to manage things underground and sort of understand all the laws around it and things like that is, you know, it's sort of representative of the advantage of those kinds of pools of talent that exist already in Texas and several companies like those in Texas. I think that really will be, is an opportunity for Texas.
Ellen, how about you in the human capital for projects?
No, I really think that there's a lot of very capable people who understand the substructure and issues, you know, in the mineral space. But you know, per the MRV requirements in the final regulations, there's a job description that, you know, might not have existed before. It's an independent verifier. So if you're going to do EOR and use a specific type of technique in one of the subparts under the EPA regs, you're going to need to have an independent geologist certify every year exactly how many metric tons are in the ground. And that's going to be very important from, perspective of generating the credits. You're going to need to lean heavily on those people to, to get things right and accurate. The other job I think that, hadn't really existed before is educating banks, providing, as consultants to various investors who are very new to this space. And I think a lot of those people are in Texas.
Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly how Sue plans to spend her meerschaum years, by the way, is advising people on tonnage stored. Sue, what do you think about human capital in Texas?
Yeah, we got a lot of young people. I'm at the university, so we see a whole lot of people very excited about this, wanting careers in this domain. There's a little bit of a gap because at this moment, if you graduate with a lot of experience in how to do it, there's not a job necessarily waiting for you. But so we're hoping that, next year there'll be a lot of jobs open up.
Indeed. Well, hopefully when everything else opens up, there will be a lot of jobs that open up along with it in this field. Honestly, I could just do this conversation all the live long day. It's such a treat to sit with you. I would just like to make one observation, and this is sort of where you started the conversation today, Sue. 10 years ago, this was not the kind of conversation we had. 10 years ago, it was like, what is CCS? Does it work at all? Like, why should we care? And now we're talking about crediting bureaus and tax structures and, training specific regulators and monitoring protocol. This makes me so happy and so optimistic, but not as happy and optimistic as seeing you guys here today. Thank you again for joining us. And let me thank everybody who's in the audience. Thanks again to our speakers and to the whole audience for tuning in. In just a minute, I'm going to turn it back to Julie Merino-Carella. But first, I want to restate that the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center of Global Energy Policy's website in just a few days. Also, our next event, Columbia Energy Straight Talk with Cheryl LaFleur and David Hill. Extraordinary scholars and workers. Cheryl LaFleur, longtime chairman of the Federal Electricity Regulatory Commission, FERC. David Hill, former chief counsel for NRG and former chief counsel for the Department of Energy. They're going to be talking about what do recent events mean in Texas mean for electricity markets, consumers, and the energy transition. Something relevant, hopefully, to many of you in the audience. That will be held at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, March 25th, this coming Thursday. Also 3 p.m. Central Time, for those of you who keep track that way. Last but not least, for a full calendar of upcoming events, visit the Global Center on Global Energy Policy's website online. We hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to seeing you soon. And with that, I will turn it back to Julie for final comments.
Thank you, Julio. I just want to thank Ellen, Suzanne, and Deepika again for joining us in this very engaging conversation that touched on a number of topics in CCUS. And I would agree, 10 years ago, I don't ever recall a conversation like this happening. Also, thank you, Vicky. I know she left a little bit early, but thank you for her providing keynote remarks. Again, if you would like to find out more about our Women in Energy program or the Carbon Management Research Initiative, please visit the center's website at energypolicy.columbia.edu. And we hope you have a nice rest of your day. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you all
so much.
again.
Bye.